afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you making time for this. My name is Katherine. I will be presenting today on material that is sensitive, is difficult, but is so important. And I'm excited to be able to share what I know with you and also look forward to your questions and your comments on this material. I'd like to begin first by offering a land acknowledgement. Ashton College is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh nations. The college makes this acknowledgement because it is committed to integrity, truth, and community. Ashton College encourages its broader academic community to be responsible community members, empowered with historical knowledge and respect for Indigenous sovereignty. Such knowledge is vital in any conversation about education and ongoing learning. I'm currently talking to you from my home in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'd also like to quickly offer a land acknowledgement for the land on which I live and where I work. This territory is the ancestral territory of the Beothuk and is also the unceded and traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Thank you to Ashton College for giving me the opportunity to present this work today. Thank you for everyone who is participating in this, both through the live and also catching the recording of this. Our topic today is looking at residential schools, but looking at Indigenous residential schools post Truth and Reconciliation Commission and seeking out to understand in more robust ways how the ongoing politics of reconciliation is impacting on the lived experiences of survivors, their families, and their nations in the shadow of residential schools. I'm going to begin tonight by offering some history of the residential school program to speak to the specifics of what actually happened in this program. Following a little bit of context and that historical piece, I'd like to move into a more robust conversation around colonialism and the politics of residential schools, the actual power and the inequalities housed within this program, and what their lasting impacts have been. Finally, I'd like to speak a little bit about the public apologies that have taken place and link this conversation into broader conversations around how all of us have obligations and responsibilities in reconciliation and in making sense of how we move forward, both as a nation and as individuals within the settler colonial state. I'd like to position myself in this conversation too, as a settler and also as someone who has been extremely privileged to receive academic training in this area. I want to really make it clear to you that I come from a position of privilege, but I hope to use that privilege in really healthy ways. And part of how I want to do this is to ensure that every opportunity I have to share knowledge on this topic, I'm able to communicate in ways that people can relate to and understand. Part of what our responsibility is when it comes to residential schools and when it comes more broadly to reconciliation is to ensure that not only we seek out information, but the information that we're given is good and allows for positive change. It's not enough to simply sit and say we know what happened in the residential schools. Part of our responsibility is the action piece as well, to move forward with a commitment to make changes in our own society. The history of the residential schools begins many, many years ago. The late 1800s, around 1870, maybe a little bit later in some provinces, all the way through until 1996, when the final residential school in Canada closed. Over this long history, in excess of 150,000 students in the residential schools attended the residential school system. The exact number of students varies, and record keeping was poor. In many cases, it's very difficult to say definitively how many students would have attended any school at a given time, but 150,000 students would have attended these schools. They were Métis, they were First Nations, and they were Inuk. As a result of their experiences in these schools, we saw dramatic increases in how intergenerational trauma was being experienced within Indigenous populations from coast to coast to coast. Every province and territory except for New Brunswick and PEI had residential schools. Initially, and through the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation process, Newfoundland and Labrador residential schools were not actually recognized, but now, following a lengthy process of class action, the Newfoundland and Labrador schools have also been included in the historical record. While these schools were in operation, the schools themselves became places of assimilation. Ultimately, the goal of a residential school was not to educate or to teach, but was a place in which social and cultural norms were being destroyed and replaced with what was considered more acceptable, those of the settler colonial society. As a result, many people describe the process of the residential school system as being a cultural genocide. What we've become more and more aware of as more information has come out about residential schools is that the impacts were not only cultural, there was also significant loss of life through the residential school program. Residential schools were genocidal. They were the sites of students not only losing their lives through things such as industrial accidents and disease, but also succumbing to the conditions of overcrowded and poorly funded institutions. Things like fires, building collapses, nutritional experiments that ended in students starving, all took place within residential schools. There was nothing safe about being a resident at one of these schools. Even calling them schools seems so incorrect based on the experiences. Okay, I'm going to. Okay. I'd like to show you a couple of images, and these are images that I think are sort of interesting to demonstrate what I mean in terms of how Indigenous identity was being attacked through these processes. Assimilation was ultimately the goal, to get rid of, to destroy, to subvert, and to change anything that was in its nature Indigenous about a person's identity. What's shocking about images such as the ones that I have on the screen for you is that in many cases, these were used as advertising features to demonstrate not only the success of these schools, but the benefits of residential schools to other people. This was part of sort of the propaganda of residential schools and how they were designed to give the impression that what they were doing in any way could be seen as positive. What we know to be true, though, is that nothing about residential schools were positive for people who experienced massive amounts of traumatic experience within them. Things like physical violence, things like harassment, things like sexual violence, all took place within these institutions. These images are striking. Things such as regalia, cultural dress, cultural hairstyles, even the way that people are standing in these images begin to change through the processes of assimilation that was enacted within the residential schools. Children entering residential schools could be punished severely for doing things such as maintaining cultural identity markers, anything from the clothing that they came into the residential school in through to the hairstyles that they had were attacked within the schools. Their heads were often shaved. Any clothing they brought from home was destroyed. They were given sort of traditionally settler colonial outfits and were expected to act as if they were settlers. In many, many cases, children had no idea what they were entering into when they arrived at these schools. In many cases, they were taken from their families by members of the RCMP, by local Indian agents, and by other officials who would be removing these children from their families and from their home communities. That disassociation, that dislocation from their place of birth, from their families, from any sort of cultural affiliation within their own nations, meant that many of these children lacked the social resources and the capacity to overcome a lot of the trauma that they experience within these schools. So what are some of these lasting impacts? How does it continue to, even now, we're getting close to 20 years following the closure of the final school. What sort of today is the lasting impact of these schools? In terms of more collective experience, the overrepresentation of Indigenous families in care, within child protection, within any sort of in-care environment, this is definitely a direct link to experiences with residential schools. Part of this is due to intergenerational trauma. Many survivors speak to the fact that because of the residential school experience, they were robbed the opportunity to have healthy and supportive role models in terms of parenting, in terms of healthy family dynamics. When the people that were responsible for their care as children within these schools were deeply abusive and treated them as if they were inherently flawed and wrong simply for being Indigenous, it's not surprising that things such as parenting or child rearing later in their life would be, sort of baked into this trauma of the residential school experience. The overrepresentation of Indigenous people within corrections, too, is another point where sort of the lasting impacts of residential schools can be seen. In many cases, Indigenous people coming out of the residential school system are dealing with substantial trauma. And part of the way that trauma can be experienced socially is through individuals engaging in behavior that can be extremely antisocial, can be violent, and in many cases can lead to involvement with corrections. So whether that means incarceration, whether that means, not having access to treatment, when that would be a better pathway for some. What ends up happening is that we see far too many Indigenous people within the Canadian correction system and within the Canadian justice system more broadly. We continue to see patterns of economic, social, and health inequity within Canada as well. And what I mean by this is that when you compare Indigenous populations in Canada from coast to coast to coast to that of settler colonial populations, we see big differences between things like academic achievement, in terms of household income, in terms of employment, and all the way through to chronic conditions and health concerns. We see big numbers of Indigenous people with diabetes. And there's been some interesting research lately that looks at some of the points of connection between nutritional experiments and starvation within residential schools and later experiences with things like diabetes and other chronic health conditions. There's also, and understandably so, a great deal of distrust of the state and its institutions within Indigenous populations in Canada. And this is absolutely linked to the experience of residential schools. Many parents believed at the beginning that students who attended residential schools would be receiving care, at least adequate care. What became a readily available information for Indigenous populations and for the settler colonial state more broadly is that these schools were never designed to be good for Indigenous children. They were always designed to be good for the settler colonial state. This leads, after a century of this kind of intense violence, to levels of distrust in education, distrust in policing, distrust in government, and rightfully so, given that history. More recently in Canada, we've seen the truth-telling process also take place with the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This public inquiry, more recent than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has also made some important links between gendered violence against Indigenous women and historical realities of the residential school program. In terms of these sort of lasting impacts and these collective impacts, we see how residential schools do not stop when they're closed, that even second, third generation survivors of residential schools who may have never attended a school themselves are still dealing with these collective problems, and it continues and it will continue for subsequent generations. Individually, survivors and, vicariously their caregivers and their families also experience issues such as, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma responses, which can be experienced in a variety of different ways, including, self-harm, including suicidal behavior, and a variety of other issues as well. Language and cultural loss is another considerable personal impact of the residential schools. We see some survivors of the residential school program who, although they knew language before they went to schools, the schools were extremely, extremely hostile to Indigenous language in any form. Being caught speaking, communicating in any way an Indigenous language was something that could be punished very severely. As a result, many survivors lost their language, which then also robbed future generations of the opportunity to have those survivors as knowledge keepers, as language keepers, and as family members that they could be reliant on to learn the language from. So language and cultural loss was another major impact. And that sort of does cross from individual impact into collective experience as well. Housing instability is another major factor as well, due to some of the ways that residential schools force students into locations that were often, quite far away from their homes, from their territories. It meant that many Indigenous people were displaced and some permanently displaced away from their initial territory. What this ends up looking like is that frequently Indigenous survivors do have challenges with housing, with mobility, with ensuring that they have a safe way back to their population where they came from. In some cases, members never felt like they could return following the trauma and all the negative experiences they had in residential schools. As a result, for some people, they've struggled with housing ever since. They've never sort of had a home, felt a home, or had the same sort of connection to place that they would have without the disruption and the violence of the residential school. Intimate partner violence, here I've called it IPV, and family conflict is another way that we see the impacts of residential schools being felt by individuals. And again, this is not only survivors alone, although there are many, many survivors in Canada still. This is also broader, can be experienced vicariously, intergenerationally, across and through families. Poor mental health, poor physical health, right? Both for survivors and also for broader community members. We see high rates of suicide, of depression, of anxiety. I've already spoken to post-traumatic stress disorder. There are a number of ways that this experience, this really, really violent government enacted experience, is felt and experienced through the ripples of generations. In addition to the mental health piece, the physical health piece, we also see as well, not only in terms of diabetes and chronic health conditions resulting from, unhealthy relationships with food following experiences of starvation in residential schools, things such as, access to good and safe, culturally appropriate healthcare is also something that we see frequently as being a gap for people who've had impacts from the residential school system. And finally, poor educational outcomes. Residential schools were not equipped to give Indigenous children a good education, an education that would set them up for success. The goal was assimilation. The bottom line of these institutions was assimilation. It was to destroy indigeneity. So in the case of education, if we think through what sort of a public school education would look like for most settler children, the basics of math and of science, of humanities, of English, and also more importantly, of learning Indigenous languages, of learning Indigenous traditions and cultural practice. These things were lost for people who attended residential schools. When survivors were in a position to leave residential schools, they were very constrained in what that experience would allow in terms of education and what could potentially come next. All right, so in addition to the harm, the trauma, the violence of residential schools, I think it's also critically important that we discuss how residential school sites were also opportunities for bravery and for resilience and for resistance on the part of children, because ultimately that's who we're talking about when we talk about residential schools. Most of the attendees, most of the people incarcerated within residential schools were somewhere between 4 and 16 years old. But in some cases, they also were a little bit older, late teens as well in some cases. But these schools were also sites where Indigenous children were extremely resilient. For example, in sort of secret, they would share stories, they would share teachings, they would share regalia. They would pass around drums, they would bring things into the schools and protect them. So that other children would have access to really important Indigenous cultural practice and, these different items. They risked severe punishment. They risked a lot to ensure that these teachings, this knowledge wasn't lost. Many Indigenous children, certainly would be fortunate in that Indigenous nations and their families would continue to advocate on their behalf. So in some cases, Indigenous people, under other pretenses potentially, would enter into these schools and would do everything they could on behalf of children. There's stories in residential schools of Indigenous people coming into the school as arts teachers, as groundskeepers, and really doing everything they could to support students while they were in these environments. In many cases, Indigenous children also enacted against the physical spaces, which is sort of interesting, either by destroying or tampering with the structures of the schools themselves in these little moments of resistance, right? Of sort of looking at the power of the residential school and enacting some resistance to it. So what does resistance look like, and what did resistance do? Well, what is important to remember is that even in the face of sort of the crushing power of the settler colonial state, when you think about the power inequality across Indigenous children within these schools that were forced to attend, and their parents could face, significant consequences for not sending their children. And then when you look at what students actually did in terms of not only surviving, but in many cases, becoming advocates, becoming leaders, and decades later being the truth tellers who participated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It really speaks to the power of these individuals. Children are resilient, but to see what Indigenous children in these schools survived is really something. And again, it sort of speaks to the strength of Indigenous nationhood, of Indigenous sovereignty. More recently, our sort of collective consciousness has shifted in Canada. And what I'm speaking to is over the last summer and spring, when the rediscovery, because people didn't know where they were initially, of unmarked burials, burials that were concealed, burials that hadn't been recorded properly or the records had been lost, started being relocated across Canada. And, I'm speaking predominantly to a BC audience. Of course, the experience at Kamloops really became sort of the important tipping point when public knowledge of this issue became that much stronger. TRC published its final report in 2015. And for many people, they wouldn't have read it within the settler colonial population or really given much thought to it. But those discoveries and that sort of heightened awareness of the intensity of the violence of the residential school program allowed for a greater public conversation. And more recently, we've seen some really powerful indications that this problem is a lot more significant than people initially realized within the settler colonial population. Now, this isn't new information to Indigenous nations. From coast to coast to coast, survivors, families, communities have spoken about how many Indigenous children went missing, disappeared, or just were never accounted for within the residential schools. Part of the challenge with these burials is that record keeping was not good within residential schools. In many cases, the records were incomplete. They were oftentimes destroyed because, as I spoke to, residential schools in some cases were burnt down or destroyed. As a result, so were the records. So doing that archival work of not only finding the records of student attendance, but also finding the more difficult archival record of the deaths of students while attending these institutions. In a lot of cases, the records are piecemeal at best. And what that means is that now, as these graves are being discovered, rediscovered, and more attention is being played to it, a lot of people are asking, well, where is the records? How do we figure out who these children were and what their stories were and what happened to them? And it's a daunting problem to figure out how to collect that information when in many cases the information is either buried under decades of paper, or in some cases it just doesn't exist anymore at all. There's, of course, the challenge here, too, of finding ways to share information and to gain information from parties that may not be forthcoming. And what I mean by that is that throughout the history of, the sort of post-residential school process, it's been difficult to get records from certain churches, certain institutions. It's been more challenging. So in the case of these burials, the work is ongoing, and truthfully, I think it's going to take a while before we see the full extent of these burials and what the impact of them will be. Right within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was an entire volume within the final report devoted to missing children. So even though this sort of became big media, big news story in the spring and in the summer, this is an issue that's been well known for many, many decades. And of course, for Indigenous families, for Indigenous survivors, they would have been aware of this and trying to bring attention to this problem for many, many decades before that. But the TRC itself identified this as a major issue and said, there are thousands of Indigenous children that we know were at these schools and we know something happened to them. So the work with this is ongoing. Of course, a number of First Nations have since committed to doing the really, really hard and difficult and taxing work of ground penetrating survey of the sites of residential schools, going through the grounds, and seeking to find these burials. In some cases, the reason that they are unmarked is sort of environmental. I think about some of the residential schools on the prairies where because of wildfires, because of snow, because of these sort of environmental conditions, the fencing around the perimeter of burials and potentially even headstones would have been destroyed over time. In other cases, these burials would have been concealed. So it's important to figure out the nature of how these burials became unmarked and what really took place and what happened to these children. The sort of truth-telling of the residential school system continues. The work that was begun by survivors through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not over. And certainly there is a lot more work to be done to get closure for families who still don't have answers for what happened to their loved ones, but also to have a really good baseline knowledge of just the extent of the violence. Because truthfully, when we do all commit to reconciliation, to engaging in new relationships between settlers and Indigenous people, we have to be armed with good information. And part of that is understanding just the nature and the scope of the violence within the residential school program. So I've got a link here. I would encourage anyone who is able to please have a read through the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The calls to action are the forward-facing component of the report. So the TRC was designed to be an opportunity for survivors, community leaders, activists, Indigenous scholars to come forward and to give expert testimony and to be witness to the violence of the residential school system in a way that hadn't been done at that scale. So it really was an important moment in Canadian history. However, what's happened since in terms of the calls to action is that the work has been slow on the part of the federal government. It'll be interesting to see how Canada continues to commit to proceeding with the calls to action, because, you know, as I'll discuss in another few moments, language and words are so important, but action, right? Committing to real change, to real progress, to measurable action is so important as well. We've come into an era in Canadian federal politics where apology is something pretty important. We've all probably seen these apologies, especially regarding residential schools. Going back a little ways, under Prime Minister Harper's administration, we saw the first federal apology offered by a sitting Prime Minister for the residential schools program. Harpers Apology ushered in a really important new era and coincided with the commitment to pursue the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to have, you know, some funding available to compensate survivors of the residential school program. Harper's Apology was incredibly important and also had limitations. And we'll talk about those a little bit here. I'm hoping that maybe that'll come through in our questions as well. Several years later, we saw then Prime Minister Trudeau offering an apology of his own. And what's interesting within my own context is that Trudeau's apology was to extend recognition to residential schools within the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, who had been left out of Harper's initial apology. So over, you know, the time span between the Harper administration through to eventually Trudeau's administration, we saw the process of apology, you know, taking place. And what is important to remember with these is that apologies are power laden, and that apologies are politically wrought. That they are at their core not neutral things. You know, that when people apologize, who they're apologizing on behalf of, who they're apologizing to, what they're apologizing for, these are all political questions. They're about power. And in the case of both of these prime ministers, it's really interesting to look at the nature of how they were apologizing and what they were committing to in terms of their own responsibility. Okay, so I've taken a couple of chunks out of Harper's Apology for residential schools. And what I can tell you about this material is that Harper's Apology, both as a video and as sort of a manuscript form, can be watched or read pretty broadly online. And what I've done here is I've sort of highlighted some interesting language that was used within this apology. Uh, there's some important things that are said here. This isn't to discount entirely this apology. For a lot of Indigenous people, this was such an important moment, and there was real power to hearing a sitting prime minister not only name the residential school program, but to indicate that it was harmful and that it did harm to Indigenous people. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others never returned home. So already, during the sort of late 2000s, we see Harper's acknowledgement that children died while attending residential schools, which at the time, for some was shocking. Even that was shocking information within settler colonial populations. Harper continued to say that the government now recognizes that the consequences of Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that their policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. So again, sort of speaking to these collective and also personal impacts of residential schools. And absolutely, something that I find really interesting in the act of apology, something that not only we see in Harper's Apology, but later in subsequent apologies offered by other Canadian politicians, is the framing of residential schools as a quote unquote sad chapter in our history. And part of the reason I pick on this language is because a sad chapter in our history insists upon a time bracketing. It insists that this happened in the past and that it belongs in a history textbook, that it's simply a chapter that can be closed, the book can be shelved, it can go collect dust in a library somewhere, instead of indicating that although things occurred in the past, they are experienced and they continue to matter in the present. In the case of residential schools, this couldn't be any clearer than how we see intergenerational trauma percolate within Indigenous nations. Calling it a sad chapter not only sort of closes the chapter and time brackets the experience of residential schools, it also functions to obfuscate responsibility in that it's easy enough to say, if this sad chapter occurred back then, our government now simply isn't responsible. So there is some real political heavy lifting housed within that fairly simple language. I encourage all of you who are listening to this and participating in this session to listen to the kind of language that's being used, especially by federal politicians around residential schools. Listen for things like sad chapter or a moment in history or the era of residential schools. Listen for that real treatment of residential schools as being located at a discrete historical moment, as opposed to being an ongoing issue that the Canadian government and Canadian settler colonial society grapples with every day. And we need to remember that it's not enough to sort of say this happened in the past and let's move on, because it's not possible to move on from an issue that continues to have such long-lasting and significant consequences for so many people. More recently, following those discoveries of unmarked burial grounds, starting in BC and moving across the country, Trudeau offered a less formal than Harper's Apology, but still an apology nonetheless, to Cowessess First Nation. And we see a lot of similarities here in terms of language choices, in terms of how residential schools are being explained. What was striking within Trudeau's apology was just how many times he included the word past, right? This is a piece of our past, of decades past. We cannot undo in the past. There was this real focus on making distance, right? Making space between the current government and the current government's response to the issue and the wrongs of this historical program. I think here it's interesting to see that there is more in terms of commitment to unpacking the violence of the experience, but there isn't a lot in terms of concrete steps forward. Uh, so certainly within Trudeau's apology, he indicates that this First Nation and other First Nations who are undergoing the work of locating these unmarked burial grounds um, are going to be receiving all of the federal government's continued support and partnership. But what does that mean? What does that sort of support and partnership look like in terms of funding, in terms of expertise, in terms of resources? What was that commitment really? A good apology, and an apology that would be appropriate in these instances of violence and trauma, would be not only a declaration of what happened and what went wrong, but also concrete commitments to what will be done in the future. And I think watching this sort of trajectory of how apology has taken over within this era of reconciliation that we are all in is really important to making sense of how residential schools still factor into settler colonial politics, federal politics, following the completion of the TRC. I really like Paulette Reagan's quote here, and so I've saved it for all of you as well. Reagan asks, what would it mean in concrete terms for the majority to shoulder the collective burden of history and legacy of residential school systems? So what Reagan is speaking to here is that for a long time, residential schools were treated as sort of the responsibility or the burden of Indigenous people alone. And what Reagan is indicating, and others have indicated as well, is that all of us have a role. All of us have a responsibility within reconciliation, within arming ourselves with this knowledge, and within ensuring that there is accountability moving forward. Corntassel, echoing what sort of I've commented on within these apologies, indicates that state applications of reconciliation tend to relegate all committed injustices to the past while attempting to legitimate the status quo. That's really important, right? That this time bracketing, this distancing, this work of using language to make things appear further away from someone is important here. And it's used as an attempt to legitimate the status quo. So continuing to speak about residential schools as if they are located in this distant past, comfortably removed from settler colonial present day, does harm in that it makes it very difficult to see and to dismantle the inequities that continue to be faced in Canada. And I just quickly like to sort of track through a bit of a timeline that, this language of reconciliation, the politics of apology, these are not new things within the Canadian state. Since 1998, we've seen sort of this idea of reconciliation emerging within the discourse of the federal government, and more sort of popularly as well within media accounts of residential schools as well. But we do see an intensification of how residential schools are being communicated, especially following TRC. So if we can sort of position truth and reconciliation within the TRC framework in the late 2000s through to about 2015 when it was published as a final report, that is really when we see the ushering in of this apology frequency that we see. And it'll be important to continue to track this issue. This residential schools continue to have a pretty substantial impact on Canadian federal politics and beyond. Although closed, in many cases demolished, some schools have been repurposed, others are simply crumbling. These schools as structures, as sites of colonial violence, remain extremely powerful within Canadian society. The social and cultural impacts will remain for generations. And intergenerational trauma is something that we are increasingly becoming aware of and seeing just how long lasting it is. The discovery more recently of unmarked burials, or burials that we had lost track of through the course of history, illuminates the intensity of the violence of the residential school program, but also speaks to the ongoing work that still needs to take place. So I encourage all of you on sort of participating in this conversation to commit in your own way to what reconciliation can look like, how you can engage in these conversations with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers, and how we can all be part of the ongoing work of reconciliation and of ensuring that this important information is understood by many. If you're a survivor or an Indigenous person struggling with re-traumatization, we've got some resources that can be shared as well. The Indian Residential School Crisis Line is 604-985-4464 or 1-866-925-4419. The Indian Residential School Survivor Society is 1-800-721-0066. There's also a National Hope for Wellness helpline, 1-855-242-3310. Thank you very much, everyone.